Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder, and with the French coming out in the next major update 1.73, I thought it would be cool to go through some aircraft I would like to see from the French, and some which I think are definitely going to make it in, and others which, may be a bit dodgy, and then at the end have a little bit of a bonus one, maybe talking about, rank 6 in aircraft. For sources, I'm using various websites on the internet, including the one which I used for the tanks, the historyofwar.org, and then I'm also using two books, the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Weapons of World War II. The general editor is Chris Bishop, if you want to look it up. I did talk about the books that I'm using here in that video where I went over all of the World War II books I have in Canada. So yeah, if you want to see it there, go and have a look. Also, Military Missions Fighter by Ralph Laneberger. He's actually the general editor of the thing, same with the other book. All of the stuff is, basically snippeted together and put together. So yeah, we're going to go through 5 aircraft, and then we're also going to do a little bonus one at the end of it. So let's get started. Let's talk about an obvious pick. Before we do, I apologize for all of my pronunciations. Obviously, I'm not French. I do know the French language incredibly well, but I have this horrible British accent. So, yeah, when it comes to names and stuff like that, I'm going to butcher them, so I apologize in advance. The first plane we're going to talk about is the Marine-Saulnier MS-406. So if you don't know what this plane is, we have the D520 and the D521 in game. I would actually categorize this as the predecessor to those aircraft. It was actually ordered in 1932. They needed some kind of design for a fighter aircraft, a monoplane, which would have decent armament on it, which had an undercarriage which would get brought up into the aircraft and would be able to deal with the aircraft at the time. So over the next few years, obviously because it was a project by the government, tons of people submitted their designs and they decided to go for the Marine-Saulnier fighter, which was put forward. Now, even though at the time of 1932, 1934, this machine was seen as pretty good, because you've got to remember, this is really much before the Bf-109, before the Bf-110, other powerhouses that the Germans started producing. The issue with the MS-406, which was the variant of the Marine-Saulnier fighter, which came around in 1939-1940, was that it was massively outclassed by the Bf-109, even stuff like the Bf-110 it struggled against. And this meant that when in 1940 the Battle of France started, even though the MS-406 was one of the most populated fighters in the air when it came to the French army, it really wasn't very good. And this is basically down to a bunch of factors. It wasn't fast enough, it was too heavy, it didn't really have the gun loadouts. You've got to remember, France was stuck like maybe 5 years behind on the whole gun front, so therefore taking out stuff like even Bf-109s was hard to do. And it got to a point where they lost 150 of them in the Battle of France actually in combat, and then 100 of them were actually lost on the ground before they even took off. So the initial order for the MS-406 was actually 367, which is a decent amount, but as with all of these planes from the French, the order was dropped to 278. So you have 278 aircraft. In the Battle of France itself, 150 of these were lost, and they didn't trade one for one. And they lost 100 on the ground, so 250 out of your 278 aircraft were pretty much decimated in a few months, and that's just because it was not able to compete with the Bf-109. If we look at the armament of this machine, it has the 120mm HS-404 hub-firing cannon, which is the exact same 20mm that you see on the D520 in-game, and it also had 2 of the 7.5mm Mac 1934 machine guns. So once again, it's basically the same armament as the D520, but it's 2 less on the 7.5 millimeters. So if we see this in game, I can definitely see it being around that 1.7, 2.0 BR, so it comes up against early BF-109s and you know, stuff like that, and it would be a really interesting fight. But unfortunately, just like a lot of these French aircraft, they were the plans to develop a certain aircraft required, you know, in the early 30s or mid 30s, and then when these aircraft actually came around, late 30s, their time had already passed, and this was mainly because of the German advancement in technology. Not really France's fault in that much regard. But then again, you look at the British advancements in technology, looking at the Hurricane and the Spitfire, yeah, okay, maybe it was their fault. But anyway, we'll move on to the next one, and we are going to a different little area. What we're going to be talking about here, if I can just find the page, is light and medium bombers. But this one is more of a kind of light bomber slash attacker idea, and it is the Breguet 693. Now, just as the same with the MS series, there was a bunch of Breguets actually designed for not a competition, but you know, those specifications sent out, so therefore the Breguet had to be designed. And there was another machine, the Potez, which was going up against the Breguet, and the Breguet actually won out against it, which was kind of interesting, at least in the role that they were looking for. So the Breguet 690, which was the predecessor to the 693, was designed in the response to a 1934 French Air Ministry specification calling for a twin-engined 3-seat fighter. So that was the specification, and what they got was kind of that, and it actually, as I said, beat out the Potez 630, which is kind of interesting. Which is definitely another machine that we're going to get into the game. Now, the 690 design was actually started in 1935, there was a prototype in 1937, and then when we look at the 691, which was the next one, that was in 1938, and then the 693, which is the one that I'm talking about, it came around at about the same time. The big difference between like the 690 to the 693 is the different engines, and also the different amounts of people who are actually in the plane itself. So the 690, obviously, it was designed for the 3-seater, basically navigator, bombardier, and pilot, and then basically they could switch around a little bit. And then when the 691 came around, they changed it to a 2-seater twin engine with ground attack as a ground attack aircraft, so they added more guns to it. And then the 693 came around, and they basically did the same thing, just improved it with different guns and different engines. So if we look at the 693, because there was also a bunch of others made, the 694, 695, 696, so you could see any of these really in game, but I think focusing on the ground attack variant, the best ground attack variant of the Breguet, which is the 693, is probably the way to go. So maximum speed was 304 miles per hour, which doesn't really seem that fast, but you've got to remember that's basically the speed that the MS could go. So that either shows how underpowered the MS was, or that shows that it wasn't too bad for this machine, even though it's still behind the times when we look at the BF-109. But you know, against the BF-110, you can see it's kind of comparable. The BF-110 is better in every way, but at least this thing has a bit going for it compared to the MS. What is interesting, though, is that it had one 20mm Hispano Sousa cannon and two 7.5mm machine guns firing forward, and then it had one machine gun which was pivoted mounts in the rear cockpit, and then one fixed 7.5mm firing obliquely from the ventral position in the later models, so that includes the 693. And then it had two more 7.5mm machine guns, one in each engine nacelle, firing backwards, and also up to 400 kilos. So this thing had a 20mm going forward, plus 2.75mm, with the addition of another one if you required. It had two 7.5mm out of the engine nacelles looking backwards, and it also had a turret on the back of it with a 7.5mm. So if I was going to make a comparison in the game that we have right now to what this machine would be, it would probably be the Blenheim. The Blenheim is a pretty close idea, with the little turret on the bottom of it, with the turret on the top, and also the forward-firing guns. Maybe the Breda 88 might be a good example as well. But it is a really cool-looking aircraft. It has a really interesting tail with the twin tail on the back of it. But overall, it's not going to be a brilliant machine, but then again, there aren't going to be that many brilliant machines for France. There's just going to be some really interesting designs. And then, you know, I'm not going to really touch the rank 3-4 argument. I want to see where they go with it. So instead, I'm focusing on, like, rank 1 and 2. Like, this is definitely a rank 1 aircraft, probably around 2.0, 2.3. I can't see it being any higher than that, really, to be quite honest. Moving on, staying on the kind of same track, we're looking at the Potezes. So the Potez 631 was seen as the, not competition, but very similar to the Blenheim. So basically what I said about the Breguet. And it was designed in the same competition as the Breguet, as I said before. It's a lot slimmer in design to the Breguet, and looks, in my opinion, much more like just an elongated IL-2. And this is obviously just from, you know, what I think, but generally it looks kind of interesting. The issue with the Potez that the French had is it was one of these machines very similar to the BF-110, where they had a bunch of them, and they were trying to find a way to actually incorporate it into their armed forces. So you have the Potez, and it was used in so many weird, different ways. And none of them worked because they designed it for they designed the Potez 630 to be like this, you know, three-man manned, twin-engined fighter thing, and then they didn't win that contract, so they designed the Potez 631, which was going to be a night fighter variant, which is probably the one we're going to get in game because that was the one which was used the most. There's also the Potez 633, which was a 2-seat bomber one, but unfortunately that was cancelled. But maybe we see something like that, because at least it would have some use. With the Potez 631 being a night fighter, it was incredibly bad at its job, and this was just an unfortunate thing with early war night fighters, where they didn't have the technology with them. There was a lot of issues with them when it came to just, you know, going after planes and spotting them, and it doesn't really help with the Potez that it is a large machine, meaning that you could probably hear it from miles away. I'm going to read from the history of war about it, because it's not great, to be honest, when you actually read about it. So, in May 1938, an order for 125 Potez 633 2-seat bombers was cancelled and replaced with one for the same number of Potez 631s. A third order for 52 aircraft was placed in June 1938, bringing the total of aircraft on order up to 10 conversion trainers and 207 operational aircraft. 2 small export orders were also received for 1 aircraft from Yugoslavia and 4 aircraft from China. So that's your basic numbers. About 200 of these were made, which is a decent amount to be put into game. Now let's talk about the Battle of France, where these things were probably used the most. Or maybe actually in the Phony War period. They were used to actually drop leaflets and stuff, very much the same as the Breguets, and they took a lot of fire from anti-aircraft guns, and because they were quite slow and low, yeah, they got knocked out of the sky. But anyway, on the 10th of May 1940, the Armée de l'Air had 75 Potez 631s in frontline units, with 53 of them serviceable. 4 night fighter units were allocated to the defense of Paris, and the 5th to the defense of Lyon, Etienne, and the Le Creusot area. The day fighter unit, ECM I-16, was at West Tuesday, or Tuesday, however you say that. Finally, the Navy's Flottille F-1C was at Calais. The naval unit was the most successful Potez 631 unit of the Battle of France. Between the 10th to the 21st of May, it shot down 12 German aircraft over the North Sea, losing 8 Potez 631s. The units then withdrew to convert to the Bloch 151 and Dewotin 520 and didn't return to the fighting. The 5 night fighter units were not a success, so basically what it was designed for, it wasn't good at. They began to fly night operations on the 11th of May, but there was no successful interceptions during the first week of operations. The French High Command then decided to try and use the aircraft in the increasingly desperate day battle. On the 17th of May, 24 Potez 631s from the units based around Paris attempted to attack German columns around Fourmi. 18 aircraft reached the target area, 6 were lost, probably all to German flak. So, yeah, the Potez 631, designed as a night fighter, completely useless as a night fighter, so they decided to try and use it in this ground attacker role just like the Breguet 693, and, well, it just wasn't good at it, unfortunately. The night fighter units achieved their first success on the 18th of May when an aircraft from ECN 113 shot down a Heinkel HE-11. Sadly, on the same day, the aircraft resemblance, the Bf-110, resulted in Potez 631s, or 631, being shot down by an MS-406 after being attacked by German fighters and French flak. This was also an issue that the French had. They kept shooting down their own planes. Now, whether this is because of communication errors or just resemblance, because this also happened with Typhoons for the British. A lot of British AA crews thought that the Typhoon looked very much like the Focke-Wulf, so they would try and shoot them down, so therefore that's why they had crazy markings on the bottom of them to make sure that the AA crews knew what they were. But the Potez 631, it does look like the Bf-110, quite a lot. So I'm not really surprised that the MSs flying around did take a few of them out. But it's just an unfortunate thing, really. Another Potez was shot down by 3 Block 152s on the 23rd of May, and on the following day the Armée de l'Air ordered recognition stripes to be painted on each aircraft. So yeah. So, to try and stop their own aircraft getting shot down, they did the Typhoon treatment, and that's completely fine. From the 20th of June, the night fighter units were forced to retreat south to escape the advancing Germans. At the end of the Battle of France, the 5 night fighter units claimed 4 confirmed victories and 8 probables, but at the cost of 10 fighters lost to enemy action and 3 to friendly fire. So they got 4 kills, and they lost 13 fighters. Now, that's a really bad ratio, especially if you're going after bombers, you've got to remember. Now, if you add in the 8 probables, that's still a negative KD for these machines, which is really not good. But if we look at their armaments, it's very similar to the Breguet. So, 2 fixed forward firing 20mm, so it does have 2 20mm on it, which are pretty cool, and 1 handheld 7.5mm machine gun in a dorsal position. Some aircraft were also fitted with 2 7.5mm machine guns under each wings. So the most you could have from this thing is, 2 20s looking forward, plus 2 7.5s, and then you had the typical Bf-110, turret on the back, or the Breguet turret, depending on which one you want to use. And then after that, after the Battle of France, they were basically used by the Vichy Air Force as reconnaissance aircraft. They weren't really used in that many attacks, and also they were used in Operation Dragoon as reconnaissance aircrafts again. Generally, when something doesn't really have a place in the army, what happens to them is that they are forced into some kind of reconnaissance or, some kind of role like that. So, at least they kind of found their place there. I'm sure there are a lot other planes which were better than it, but if you have just an aircraft lying around, I mean, you might as well use it. It's an unfortunate plane, like the Breguet. It was a plane which was designed early 1930s, didn't come into fruition until the late 1930s, ran into the Bf-109s, Bf-110s, and, the Ju-87s and the Heinkels, and even the Ju-88s, and was like, well, I can't do jack shit. Because of weaponry, because of speed, because of maneuverability, because of all of these things. And the difference is the Breguet could actually carry bombs. Now, I'm pretty sure the Potez could at some point as well, but I can't find any reference to the 631 version being able to actually carry any bombs. It was a sad life for the Potes, or the Pote, depending on how you want to say it, but it is how it is, you know. Sometimes designs don't work, and you've got to move on. So let's move on to some two other aircraft. First of all, we have the Farman F-220. Now this is going to be either the rank 1 or rank 2 heavy bomber that the Americans? The French get. This was a mid-1930s aircraft, once again designed for a competition by the government to try and get some kind of large bomber, so it could be used not just in a bombing role but also in maybe a transport role. And Air France actually used a bunch of these, the F-224, after the war and during the war, 40-seater airliner. The one that I'm mainly talking about when we look at the Farman is the F-222, because this was the version which actually was at least kind of used. I mean, overall, if we look at all the variants, there was only 3 of them made. Sorry, not 3, 80 of them made. And they could carry a hell of a lot of bombs on them. But they definitely struggled in the defensive department. So they had 3 7.5mm in a nose turret, a dorsal and a ventral. So basically 2 looking backwards on the top and bottom of the plane, and 1 looking forward. So not great defensive armaments. If we look at the speed of the thing, it's very similar to like the S-81. Which have just been added to the game, and its bombs, it could carry up to 5,200 kilos worth of bombs. Now the thing is, if it actually could do this or not seems to be in debate. I've seen some sources which are just like, there's no way this thing could carry that much, and then I've seen other sources which are like, yes, it definitely did. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure if it actually ever carried this in real life, but it seems like it was another one of these machines which actually carried out some night bombing raids during World War II on Germany, and it also did leaflet raids, so very much similar to stuff like the Whitworth-Whitley that you will see from the British point of view. What is interesting about the 222 version compared to a lot of the pictures that you'll see that the wheels stick out on a lot of pictures if you look at the Farman F-220. And something to realize is the F-222 actually had retractable undercarriage, or the retractable gear, so therefore if we do get that version in game, it will look different to maybe what you're used to, which is completely fine. The only real notable thing about this machine is the fact that it did take part in some retreating parties. It was used for a great effect in retreating pilots, retreating soldiers who basically got on the plane and got the hell out of there before the German army ran into them, obviously if they were ordered to retreat. And this meant that it actually saved a lot of Polish fighters and Polish pilots and French pilots, and they were able to actually fight in stuff like the Battle of Britain and for the Allied side, which is interesting. Who also, one of the famous guys, James Dennis, on the 20th of June 1940, this was what I was referencing, where he took an F-22, took a bunch of pilots and just people with him, flew to Britain, and he was actually able to be part of the Free French Air Force, which did work against the the RAF against the Axis. At the same time, he actually, because of this F-222, I should say, he was able to shoot down 9 German aircraft. So in effect, he became an ace, in part to this Farman heavy bomber. But if we look at it from a gameplay point of view, you're gonna have 3 guns on it, 3 defensive armaments, which aren't going to be great because they're the 7.5s. They may be useful in rank 1 because they they may be useful in rank 1 because they are IT belts mainly, so therefore a lot of stuff at rank 1 is either wood or it doesn't have a lot of armor on it. so therefore taking them out shouldn't be too bad, especially with the 7.5s, which are rapid firing. So maybe you've got that on your side, very much similar to the 12.7s from the Italians. This thing just really reminds me of the S81. It's just one of those machines which I would like to see in game, and I'm pretty sure we will. Like, when we look at French bombers, there are definitely better candidates than this thing, but if we're looking for something which fits that, like S81 or just rank 1 era, the F220 or F222, depending on which one you want to put in, you could even put both of them in. I think they deserve a place in this tech tree. So hopefully we see them, you know, and also it has 4 engines, so it would be the second rank 1 bomber I think we have, which has 4 engines, after the TB3. I might be wrong though. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And the last one, which is kind of French, I suppose. It was used by the French, but it was actually created by a guy called N.V. Koolhoven, who was from the Netherlands. So, the Koolhoven FK-58. Now, this to me is a really interesting interceptor fighter aircraft. It was introduced in 1940, it fought in the Battle of France, and unfortunately, because there was only 20 of them made, it didn't really get going. And the reason why it didn't ever really get going is because a bunch of them were destroyed in a German air raid at the factory where they were built, and the rest of them were used by Polish pilots, and they did surprisingly well. Where the type service life was short-lived, with only 47 or so operational sorties recorded. The unit had no confirmed victories, but at least one FK-58 was lost after the fall of France. All surviving airframes were scrapped. So therefore, with only 20 of them made, I think 20 is a decent number to be able to, you know, use this thing. But it's just kind of sad how you had so much potential in this interesting aircraft. It could go a reasonable speed, and I think this could be a late tier rank 1 vehicle. What is also interesting is it was given to these Polish guys who had, you know, not a lot of the machines, but they were actually given them unarmed and were basically told, right, you need to find guns for these planes. So I think you could actually base an interesting single mission around the FK-58, but it's just kind of funny how can you imagine giving a pilot like a Spitfire and saying, right, you've got to go find your own guns and strap them to the machine? Because that's basically what the Polish pilots did, who actually flew these things. But technically it is a French aircraft, because it was produced for the French. But unfortunately the deal fell through because, well, the Germans decided to invade. Hopefully this gets in. Maybe it might be a premium. Or it may be a British premium for the Polish, or maybe a French premium, but it definitely was created for the French, so I can see it being in the main tree just to buff it out a little. If they do decide to go for an interesting armament on it, basically the one to go for is the 4x7.5mm Browning machine guns. That's in an underwing setting, so 2 on each side. That is basically what the Polish pilots tried to use at the time. So therefore, you know, they should definitely go for that. It's just an interesting aircraft, and I'd like to see it in the game. There's also some other aircraft that I could talk about, but I'm at my limit of 5, and I think that's a good idea. We'll move on to something which is from the Military Missions Fighter by Ralph Leinberger, and this will be the last thing. And a lot of talk has been about rank 5 French jets, and to be quite honest, the jets for the French after World War II were actually very competitive. So I'm really looking forward to the rank 5. But I was thinking about, instead of talking about some of those things, such as the Dassault Uragan or something like that, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, why not talk about the next stage? So, with rank 6 tanks, a lot of people have been talking about rank 6 jets, you know, bringing up the MiG-21, MiG-19, F-100 Super Sabre. Well, the French variant of this was actually something called the Dassault Supermyster, or the Dassault Supermyster, if you want to say it like that. I apologize if I offended anyone. And this was seen as on par to the F-100 and the MiG-19, and it was the first supersonic plane that existed in Western Europe. What is also interesting is that there was one of the first people to go supersonic in it was a lady called Jacqueline Ariol. And if you want to have a look at her, she has a really interesting story behind her, and unfortunately she had a very serious accident in one of her sorties as a co-pilot, and she had to undergo a ton of operations, basically just stopping her from being a test pilot, which is incredibly sad, especially if since it wasn't her fault that it happened. So what is interesting about this, it has two 30mm caliber DEFA 551 cannons on it, good luck with that, 2 air-to-air guided missiles, and then 35 unguided air-to-air rockets. So in my opinion, I think this would be a great case for a rank 6 jet. At the same time, it could also have 2 500 kilo bombs, or it could carry some napalm bombs or 12 anti-ship missiles. So there's also that. But the fact that it was the first in Western Europe supersonic plane, I really think it definitely should get a nod in the game if we do add in rank 6. Because it is definitely a good gap. A lot of people have been talking about stuff like the MiG-21, which is incredibly fast. And even if you want to look at the French side of it, you could go for the Dassault Breguet Mirage F1, which went 2.2 max speed. If you go for the Myster, it only went 1.12, which is equivalent to nearly 1200 kilometers an hour. So I think this would work really well for rank 6. And it also has all the bombs and stuff on it. If you want to look up the designer, it was a guy called Marcel Bloch, or B-L-O-C-H. Let's just call him eccentric. The manufacturer was also Dassault Aviation. But yeah, go and have a look at Marcel Bloch. He's definitely an eccentric old bean, very much similar to the Dambusters raid man, which I can't remember right now, the guy who created the bouncing bomb. But yeah, this is just to say that if they decide to add a rank 6 for aircraft, the French will have a jet which is easily comparable to what we've been seeing coming out of other nations at the same time. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see certain aircrafts from the French, let me know. There will be a few I won't know about, of course. So, it means that I get a bit more learned and you can teach me. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.